Hey everyone, welcome to Seneca Lake Mysteries, the podcast where we explore the unusual, strange, and unexplained on New York's largest Finger Lake. Thanks a million for joining me again and for all the support. And please continue to like, subscribe, review, and share the podcast. It all adds up. And as always, I appreciate every one of you. So this time around, I'll be revisiting the story of the mysterious round craters that were recently discovered at the bottom of Seneca Lake after a 6-year-long, high-tech, comprehensive topographic mapping of the lakebed was completed by researchers from the Seneca Lake Archaeological and Bathymetric Survey Project. We'll look at the current theory that the craters were caused by methane gas leaks in the bottom of the lake, and then take a closer look at other cases of pockmarks or craters found at the bottom of the ocean, including one that has some striking and distinct similarities with those found at Seneca Lake, although scientists believe that that site has nothing to do with methane leaks. Next, we'll dive into the possibility that an ancient civilization once roamed the Finger Lakes area. We'll start with one of the most unusual and mysterious ancient stoneworks in North America, the Bluff Point Stoneworks on Keuka Lake, and how that site just may be related to another equally mysterious spot near Seneca Lake. And finally, I'll take you through a classic UFO sighting from Ovid, New York back in 1980, which included multiple witnesses and even some strange physical effects the objects had on at least one witness. But before we get to those stories, I have a quick one to tell you guys. This story is very short and it lacks detail, so it's not quite substantial enough to spotlight it with its own segment, but the subject matter is so wild, I have no choice but to talk about it. I found this story in a book titled The Lake Country, an Annal of Golden Days in Central New York, the Land of Gold, by John Corbett, which was published in 1898. It's in a section called The Folklore, which describes some of the stranger myths and legends in the area. It's just one brief paragraph, which reads as follows, quote, "The superstition of the vampire, that horror of the grave which was supposed to harbor the dead, yet derive its sustenance from the living, had one illustration at least about Seneca Lake. Down the western shore, not many miles from its head, in the early years, the corpse of a young woman was exhumed, and the heart and other vital parts committed to the flames. The gruesome tale comports in a remarkable manner with the general sayings in regard to vampire. Of several sisters, all in succession had wasted away, until one remained, and she was ill. Though in the grave for many months, the burned portions of the body were fresh in appearance. The living sister, undoubtedly from mental relief, recovered her health after the event." End quote. So when I first started digging into the weird history of Seneca Lake, I knew there would be UFOs and lake monsters and the Seneca drums and hauntings and just maybe a cameo or two from Bigfoot, but I genuinely never expected to find out there was a vampire legend from the area, especially a story of a dead vampire being dug up and burned along the western shore of the lake. The more I look, the weirder this place gets. And I guess I should say that if you've had any vampire encounters around Seneca Lake, please let me know. So let's get to it. So back in episode 3 of the Seneca Lake Mysteries podcast, I covered a news story that had recently been published around that time, and it was related to the results of the Seneca Lake Archaeological and Bathymetric Survey Project, which was a project that was done using state-of-the-art underwater equipment that took place over 6 years that was that ended up capturing not only images of 44 canal shipwrecks, but it also created the most detailed and comprehensive topographic map of the lake's bottom that had ever been completed. So it gave us an unprecedented level of detail in understanding what Seneca's lakebed looks like. And what those researchers found was not only the 44 canal shipwrecks, but they found a field of around 70 indentations, craters, pockmarks, whatever you want to call them, each one of them around 30 feet deep and 400 feet wide, covering an area of over 4 square miles and the southern end of Seneca Lake. But what was really intriguing, to me at least, about these features on the lake's bottom were that many of the craters were near perfect circles, and they were sometimes lying in straight lines. And also, around the time that these results were published, the results were published actually in March of 2025, and then in May, it was announced that researchers from Cornell University and the SUNY College of Environmental Science and Forestry in Syracuse were being provided with a grant of over $12,000 to investigate these recently discovered holes or pockmarks or craters in the bottom of Seneca Lake to see if those holes were releasing methane or other chemicals that might explain the Seneca drums. Now, the theory of the Seneca drums being just gas bubbles rising to the surface has been around for almost 100 years, since at least 1934. But again, it's still a theory. No one has ever proven or found, evidence showing that the Seneca drums come from the release of gas bubbles that come from the bottom of the lake and rise to the surface. So I got curious about this subject, this idea of methane gas being released in the bottom of a lake and rising to the surface. So I did a little bit of research on my own, just to learn about other examples of this phenomenon happening. And it's a pretty common phenomenon in the world's oceans. The Barents Sea, which is located north of Russia and Norway. The Arctic Ocean, craters have been seen there. There are craters in the Arctic Ocean that are ancient and believed to have been caused by methane gas escaping from the bottom of the ocean. The Barents Sea, there's also craters there. The Barents Sea is north of Norway and Russia. There are craters there that have been studied and photographed that are believed to have been created by gas escaping. And while some researchers believe that there are new craters being created in the Barents Sea, there's really no evidence of that specifically happening now. The theory that these were created by methane explosions, both the Arctic Ocean and Barents Sea, both of those theories are that it took place thousands of years ago. However, of course, the idea that gas explosions or methane leaks in the bottom of the ocean are a real phenomena. They've been photographed. It does happen. It's not an uncommon event. Now, I was also curious about the craters in Seneca Lake seeming to be, they seem to be of mostly uniform sizes and arranged in linear fashion. So I was wondering if that phenomena is also tied to these Arctic Ocean craters or Barents Sea or any of these other locations with gas leaks in the bottom of the ocean. And none of them really were. Crater Lake, which is in Oregon and is the deepest lake in the United States at 1,949 feet, has craters on the lake's bottom, but they're various sizes. Some of the photos I've seen, different sizes. They don't really seem to have the same kind of order that the pockmarks in the bottom of Seneca Lake have. So this field of craters in the bottom of Seneca Lake is highly unusual, specifically because of the uniformity. Like I've said, the uniformity of size of a lot of the craters and the fact that a lot of them seem to be arranged in rows. But I did find one example of a field of pockmarks or craters in the bottom of the ocean that are uniform in size and seem to be arranged in lines, and those are known as the pockmarks of Big Sur, or the Big Sur pockmarks off the coast of California. Now, the Big Sur pockmark field, as compared to Seneca Lake, the one on Seneca Lake is just over 4 square miles. The Big Sur pockmark field is roughly the size of the city of Los Angeles, which would be 400 to 500 square miles, I would believe. The Seneca Lake pockmarks, there's about roughly 70 of them. The Big Sur pockmark field has over 5,200 craters on the ocean floor. The craters in Seneca Lake are roughly 400 feet across and about 30 feet deep. The formations in Big Sur are roughly 650 feet across, so larger, and about average of 15 feet deep, which is half the depth of the pockmarks in Seneca Lake. And what was very interesting to me is that for decades, researchers and scientists have believed that the Big Sur pockmark field was caused by methane gas leaking through the ocean floor. But in recent years, there have been discussions of putting in wind farms out in the ocean right in that area around the Big Sur pockmarks. And there were concerns that if there was methane leaking through the ocean floor, that would cause stability problems for the wind farm. So researchers took another look at it and came to a very different conclusion back in 2024. So there was extensive research done by the Monterey Bay Aquarium Research Institute, the MBARI, along with help from the U.S. Geological Survey and Stanford University. They used state-of-the-art underwater robots to map the pockmark field and to research the sediment, and they found absolutely no signs of methane. And of course, I found this very interesting, considering what's going on at Seneca Lake, that there's going to be further research done on the pockmarks in Seneca Lake, which have been, the Seneca drums have been believed to be caused by methane, and now that these pockmarks have been found, it's believed to be caused by methane. But this research being done out in California is showing that these assumptions were wrong, at least about that pockmark field. So what did the researchers in California figure out? What did they say caused these pockmarks? They discovered that powerful ancient sediment flows, so mud, sand, water rushing downhill along the seafloor, almost like underwater avalanches, have been shaping and creating and maintaining those pockmarks for hundreds of thousands of years. They estimate 250,000 years or more, 280,000, or more. Now, of course, even though the photographs or the bathymetric images of the Big Sur pockmarks do look quite similar to the bathymetric images at the bottom of Seneca Lake and those craters, there's still a huge difference in the locations, because you're talking about the shore of the Pacific Ocean compared to a freshwater lake in the middle of upstate New York. It's understandable how hundreds of thousands of years of ocean floor sediment moving back and forth, avalanches, underwater avalanches, the power of the tide of the oceans causing the sediment to swirl and to move in these patterns and creating these pockmarks in the bottom of the ocean. How would that have happened in Seneca Lake? Are the currents of Seneca Lake strong enough to create these types of indentations in the bottom of the lake? Were these indentations created hundreds of thousands of years ago in the bottom of Seneca Lake? Are they actually incredibly ancient? It's hard to tell, and I'm not an expert, but I am going to make a prediction right here on the Seneca Lake Mysteries podcast. I predict that the research that's done by Cornell University and the SUNY ESF are going to find no indication that methane created these pockmarks in the bottom of Seneca Lake. I think the Seneca drums are a bigger mystery than anyone wants to admit. I think these pockmarks are a much bigger mystery than anyone is admitting at the moment. And I invite everyone to go back, look at these images that were released of the bottom of Seneca Lake. Go to SenecaLakeMysteries.com. I have the images up there, and look at and remember that this is a detailed, high-tech topographic map of the bottom of the lake. These aren't rough images. These are huge, round, some of them perfectly round, craters in the bottom of the lake that are arranged in just one small area, arranged in perfect lines at times. And I'll also put some links in the description, or at least a link to show the Big Sur pockmark field as well, so you can see just how similar they are. And I will be interested to see what the researchers find in the next year or so when they're studying these pockmarks and seeing if there are any chemicals or methane leaks down there. But I also strongly believe that this finding, this field of pockmarks in the bottom of Seneca Lake, is extremely unusual for a freshwater lake. I've looked at bathymetric maps of Lake Champlain for comparison. There are none of these pockmarks. If you look at the bathymetric map of the rest of Seneca Lake, because this is only a small portion, there are none of these pockmarks. It's a highly unusual phenomenon. that cannot be explained at this time. So this story sort of begins outside of the Seneca Lake area. So I'm going to tell you the story of this particular place. And although it's not a place within the Seneca Lake mysteries realm that I normally talk about, I'm going to, after I tell you the story, I'm going to tie it to another story from the Seneca Lake area. And the first part of the story that does take place further away isn't really that far away. It's on Keuka Lake, west of Seneca Lake. And some of you might have heard about this location called the Bluff Point Stoneworks. The Bluff Point Stoneworks are a prehistoric stone complex, stone structure located in the middle of, in between. Keuka Lake is shaped more or less like a Y. And right in the middle of that Y is where the Bluff Point Stoneworks are located. They're on a high point in between the two branches of Keuka Lake. And unfortunately, this site is mostly destroyed. There's some areas of stone and some traces of the site that are still in existence, but the original site was written about and described in the late 1800s, and the descriptions and the drawings of this site are absolutely astounding. They do not match up with any other ancient native sites or ancient stone sites in the Northeast at all. So let's get into it. The Bluff Point Stoneworks were on a roughly 7-acre area at the top of the bluff. It's right at the highest point between the two branches of Keuka Lake. And one of the more striking and unusual features of this stone complex are referred to as graded ways. And what these graded ways were long lines of stone paths or roads or whatever you want to call them, approximately 3 feet to 8 feet wide and about 1 foot high. And the base of them, the flat part, were all stones that had been laid down. And along the sides, there were additional stones embedded into the ground and standing on end and tilted inward toward the middle of these graded ways. And these graded ways were hundreds of feet long, and many of these straight lines were in crossing patterns, 90-degree angles, what have you. An extremely unusual type of structure. But in addition to these graded ways, there were several stone circles with large stones arranged in patterns standing on end, and there was one large stone and the western end of the complex that was roughly 8 to 10 feet tall, standing completely on end, often referred to as a monolith when talking about stone structures around the world. Now, unfortunately, there was never any official investigation of the site by archaeologists. It was all amateur archaeologists and other amateur researchers who studied and mapped the Bluff Point Stoneworks. And among these older accounts of the Bluff Point Stoneworks are some features that are even more intriguing and more strange, although it's essentially impossible to sort out whether these are legitimate claims or whether these were made up. But it was said that many of the stoneworks included engravings on the stone of human heads and animal heads that were arranged in patterns similar to those made by the Etruscans, an ancient civilization in Italy that were around 900 BC to about 27 BC. And another account even said that there was an engraving of the face of a veiled woman that looked to them like Isis. Now, there have been lots of theories thrown around over the years as far as who actually built the Bluff Point Stoneworks. Some folks claimed that it was the Hopewells, the mound builders, who had left their mark around western and central New York and around the Finger Lakes, apparently. However, there are no other examples of Hopewells building complex structures out of stone like the ones found on Bluff Point. There were theories that Nordic people or Celtic people who had traveled to the North American continent before Columbus had come and built these structures for various reasons, archaeoastronomy, a signal beacon, something like that. But ultimately, to this day, nobody knows who built the Bluff Point Stoneworks. And like I said, there's very little evidence left of these stoneworks, and researchers and experts, specifically in the field of ancient earthworks, ancient stoneworks, say that there are no other examples of any other site looking like this one anywhere in North America. Now, I had mentioned Bluff Point in one of my previous podcasts, one of the ones where I was speaking with Soraya up at Willard Cemetery, and I had mentioned it. One of my listeners heard that episode and kind of rekindled my interest in Bluff Point, sent me a link a couple weeks ago. I'm going to put that link in the description. It's a YouTube video from 6 years ago that's called The Lost Civilization of Bluff Point, New York. And I encourage all of you who are curious about Bluff Point to check out that video. Very interesting, well done. And honestly, I love the title of it, The Lost Civilization of Bluff Point, New York, because the truth is, nobody knows who built this. And whoever built this should be considered a lost civilization. Also, in a interesting piece of synchronicity, there's a podcast called Legends of the Lost with Nina Alvarez. And I just found that Nina had reposted the first episode of this podcast, Legends of the Lost, which deals specifically with the Bluff Point ruins and goes into detail about a newspaper man named Gilbert T. Brewer, who brought a lot of attention to the Bluff Point ruins back in the 1930s and 40s. So I'll put that link in the podcast in the description as well. I haven't listened to the podcast, but hey, it's about Bluff Point ruins. So if you're interested in learning more, check out the links in the description. So how do the Bluff Point ruins connect with the Seneca Lake area? Well, when I was looking at the Bluff Point ruins again in recent weeks, there was one piece of information that reminded me of another old story that I talked about in the first episode of this podcast relating to Aunt Sarah's Falls in Montour Falls. Now, Aunt Sarah's Falls, as I mentioned before, is probably my favorite waterfall in the Seneca Lake area because you can visit Aunt Sarah's Falls and see the falls, which are about 100 feet high. However, you can't see from the ground that the falls actually extend another probably 200 feet above the 100 feet that you can see from the ground. There are drone videos that are really cool to see. So Aunt Sarah's Falls is so unique to me because you can't see all of Aunt Sarah's Falls. Part of it remains kind of hidden and kind of mysterious. So when I heard the mention of a carved woman's face in the stones on Bluff Point, it reminded me of a story related to Aunt Sarah's Falls. And this story I found in a report from the Ithaca Journal back in January of 1861. The name of the article is Legend Surrounds Aunt Sarah's Falls. It goes into the legends surrounding the naming of Aunt Sarah's Falls. But the part that got my attention is related to stone carving on Aunt Sarah's Falls. And here's what the Ithaca Journal article says. Quote, "The only known clue to Aunt Sarah's true identity was supplied many years ago by Gail Compton, who resided in Havana, now Montour Falls, before the Civil War. In writing about his boyhood in Havana, Compton testified concerning a stone, formerly at the site of the falls, upon which was carved the face of an Indian maid. During the gold fever in Schuyler, this stone was removed or destroyed by an eager prospector." End quote. And I've come across other mentions of this carved stone saying that someone had actually used dynamite or some type of explosive to blow up the carved face because there was a rumor that there was gold inside of the stone, which turned out to be false. Now, I understand that the carved face of an Indian woman isn't exactly the same as the carved face of an Egyptian woman, Isis, wearing a veil. But if it's true that there was a carved face of a woman at Bluff Point, and there was a carved face of a woman at Aunt Sarah's Falls and Montour Falls, which are roughly 20 miles apart, and when you consider that there are no known people or civilizations that have lived in the Northeast that were known for carving faces into stone, it adds another whole layer of intrigue because it points toward the possibility of an ancient lost civilization existing not only near Keuka Lake, but also near Seneca Lake. Who were these people? How did they get here? How long ago were they here? So many questions. Let me know what you think. Let me know if you know of any other folklore from the area that might point towards this lost civilization. And by the way, if you've never been to Aunt Sarah's Falls, it's well worth a visit. It's right along Route 14 in between Watkins Glen and Montour Falls. So this story was sent to me by Soraya Ascath from the Where Did the Road Go podcast. My compadre down in Ithaca. He sent it to me, I don't know, a couple months ago, I think. It's a really great story. It's from 1980, so it goes back a few years, but it's a newspaper report, multiple witnesses, and it's definitely worth taking a look at. So the article was published in the Finger Lakes Times in Geneva on February 22nd, 1980, and it refers to an event that happened several days earlier on February 18th, 1980, in Ovid, New York, which is, for those of you who aren't familiar with the areas, on the eastern side of Seneca Lake. So the story begins with a 11-year-old witness named Scott Niddle, and he and his mother ended up seeing this object around 9:45 p.m. So Scott said, "I was just laying in my bed and then this light came through my window and made everything orange. And at first he thought it was the moonlight, but when he took a closer look, he saw that it was an oval-shaped object with about 10 windows straight across it, and it was hovering in a field behind his house on Route 96. So he called in his mother, and she came in and she said that the whole room was lit up in an orange color. So she went over to the window and saw the thing was up in the air about 30 feet high and 150 feet away. She described it as egg-shaped and about 5 feet wide. She said, "I've never seen anything like it. It was just a big, bright orange blob." Then she said, seconds later, the object shot up straight into the air and headed north toward Auburn, and then it appeared to explode. I thought at first it was an airplane crash, but there wasn't any noise and there wasn't a fire or flames or anything. She said, "It was just like someone turned a light switch off and it was dark again, except there was like a little red blinking light that came from it after it blew up, and I just watched that until it disappeared." So Scott's mother called several relatives for help, including her husband, and that's around the time she said she discovered that her son's eyes were bloodshot. And there were other people in the area, a Myrtle Bullivant, who saw the object. She said she and her husband, Fred, watched it for about 4 minutes from the porch of their Orchard Street home. And Myrtle said it looked like a round reddish gold ball, almost orange color, and it must have been on fire, whatever it was, because we could see smoke swirling over the top of it. Very interesting description. It may have been smoke. It very possibly would have been smoke, but sometimes with these UFO sightings, there will be sort of a distortion in the air, like a distortion of a field around the object. Maybe that was what they were seeing. I don't know. But she said, but then oddly enough, she said she hadn't figured out what it was, but there was one possibility that she ruled out. It wasn't anything like a flying saucer by any means, she said. Then another witness named Shirley Durleth was sitting in the living room of her home near Boyce's Four Corners when she spotted the object. She said it looked like this big orange ball hovering in the sky. She watched it until it faded away, and she said, and then a little light appeared and then moved away and disappeared. Now, Mrs. Durleth didn't say what she thought it was, but she said, quote, "Really, it scared me half to death because I didn't know what it was, and I still don't." Another witness, a David Kaiser, who lived on Route 96, noticed the object because he said the houses in the area were all lit up in an orange color. He said it looked like a big flare and was really huge. Then there's an interesting quote from the journalist who wrote the article, Sonny Sampson, who said, "Most who spotted the object were reluctant to discuss the sighting because they said they feared public ridicule." I find that really interesting because it indicates that there may have been a lot more witnesses to this sighting, but were unwilling to talk about it publicly. Article goes on and says that the area was searched by a Seneca County Sheriff's deputy named Robert Favreau when the incident was reported that night by Scott Niddle's mother, Beverly Cowan. The deputy said nothing was found, but he said, quote, "I believe they saw something. It's just one of those unexplained things." Now, of course, at the time, the Seneca Army Depot was active, and U.S. Coast Guard had the Lawrence C. Navigational Tower, which was a navigational tower that was used by the Coast Guard. And this transmitter or station was used to guide ships and aircraft up to 1,000 miles away. So the Lawrence C. Navigational Tower, the U.S. Coast Guard personnel said they didn't detect any electrical disturbance in the area that night. So they asked Robert Zemanek, who was the public affairs director at the Seneca Army Depot, and he said there were no tests being conducted and, quote, "no one here saw anything," end quote, which I find hard to believe. Then the article goes on and says that Bob Barrow, a field investigator with the Area Phenomenon Research Organization in Syracuse, had looked into hundreds of sightings in the central New York area and said that egg-shaped objects were, quote, "quite a predominant shape in UFO sighting history," end quote. He also said that objects with windows, explosions without a noise, and bright blinking lights appearing after explosions were reported quite frequently, and red and orange glows coming from an object are also very common. He also added, interestingly, that, quote, "in many cases where there seem to be bright lights involved, you will find that someone will get bloodshot or a burning sensation in their eyes. It's almost as if they had been affected by ultraviolet light," end quote. He also said it's very common in these cases where at the scene of the sighting, there's not a trace of debris or any evidence like that. And the article concludes with Bob Barrow saying, quote, "It's just bizarre. The whole phenomenon is bizarre," end quote. So, yeah, that's a remarkable story that took place 40 years ago, over 40 years ago now, over Ovid. Anybody out there remember this? Anyone see this UFO in 1980 over Ovid? Anything to add to this? Let me know. Let me know in the comments. Shoot me an email, podcast@senecalakemysteries.com, or leave a voicemail, 607-307-1167. I'd love to hear from you, whether it's this particular incident or any sightings that you've had yourself. I know for a fact there have been numerous sightings on this side of the lake in the vicinity of Seneca Army Depot. And of course, these sightings continue to this day. I also see a similarity between the story that I told in episode 11, the Burnt Hill UFO chase. Although the object was described quite differently, it wasn't egg-shaped and it didn't have windows, but it was a bright orange object in that Burnt Hill UFO chase. Well, that's it for this time around. I hope you enjoyed it. Thanks so much for listening. And if you have any thoughts on any of the topics in this episode, please let me know. And remember to like and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and get over to SenecaLakeMysteries.com and subscribe to the email list so you don't miss anything. A new podcast comes out every month on the 7s. I'll talk to you then.